Chapter 4. The house did not stay empty. It never did. The new owners arrived in late spring, when the land was green and forgiving, when sunlight softened the sharp edges of the old structure and made the place look almost welcoming. They were practical people, not sentimental ones, and they dismissed the history with polite indifference. Houses, after all, were only brick and wood. Stories clung to them because people needed something to blame. They walked through the living room and admired the ceiling. "So much space," the woman said. "You could hear yourself think in here." If she had listened more closely, she might have noticed that the room was already listening back. Renovations began within weeks. Walls were stripped, floors sanded, and wiring replaced. The fireplace was restored to its former detail, each carved line emerging again as if remembering its purpose. Behind the mantel, the wall was thicker than expected. The contractor mentioned it casually, tapping it once with his knuckles, frowning, then moving on. Late one afternoon, while clearing debris, he uncovered something flat and cold behind the plaster. Glass. Not broken, not cracked. Perfect. By the time anyone thought to question it, the house had already begun to settle into its old shape. The contractor returned the next morning with better light and less curiosity. He measured, scratched his head, and concluded that the glass must have been part of an older decorative feature, perhaps sealed away during a previous renovation. Old houses carried oddities. This one seemed full of them. They left the mirror where it was. At first, nothing happened. The woman, Claire, spent her mornings in the living room, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and learning the acoustics of the space. Sounds behaved strangely there. Footsteps echoed, longer than expected. Her own voice sometimes came back to her with a faint delay, as though the room were thinking before responding. Her husband, Mark, noticed the cold first. Not the ordinary chill of thick walls and shaded windows, but something localized, concentrated around the fireplace. He held his hands out once, experimentally, then laughed it off. "Draft," he said. "This place has 100 years of them." That night, their son couldn't sleep. Evan was 9, old enough to know when something felt wrong, young enough to believe it mattered. He lay awake, listening to the house breathe. Pipes clicked, wood shifted. Somewhere below him, a soft, rhythmic sound repeated, almost like footsteps measured against stone. In the morning, he asked where the extra hallway went. "There isn't one," Claire said absently, pouring coffee. "There is," Evan insisted. "I saw it last night, from the stairs. It goes past the living room, longer than the house should be." Mark smiled. "Dreams can feel very real." Evan said nothing more, but that evening he stood in the living room, staring at the fireplace wall, head tilted slightly to the side. In the reflection, just beyond the archway of the living room, a door stood ajar. In the real house, there was only a wall. Mark laughed too quickly. "Reflection trick," he said. "Angle of the room." But none of them moved away. Because slowly, unmistakably, the reflected door began to open wider. No hinge creaked, no handle turned. The door simply yielded, as if responding to a pressure that did not exist in the real room. Evan took a step back, bumping into his mother's legs. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder without looking down, her eyes fixed on the glass. "That's not possible," she said. Mark raised his hand, hesitated, then lowered it again. The reflection mirrored him perfectly, except for the hand, which lifted a heartbeat later, as though reconsidering. The space beyond the door was dim but not dark. Shapes resolved slowly. A corridor stretching away at a shallow angle, its walls lined with frames that held no pictures. The air inside the reflected room looked thicker, heavier, as though light itself had weight there. Evan leaned forward before either parent could stop him. "I hear them," he whispered. "Hear who?" Claire asked, her voice tight. "Us," Evan said. "But wrong." The mirror surface rippled. Just once, like a stone dropped into still water. Mark grabbed Evan and pulled him back sharply, his pulse hammering in his ears now, the rational explanations collapsing under the simple fact that the room no longer obeyed rules. The reflected corridor shifted. It lengthened. The frames along its walls began to fill not with images, but with movement. Blurred figures passed behind the glass, never fully visible, always just out of focus. One of them stopped. It turned, and though no face could be clearly seen, all three of them knew with a certainty that settled cold in the gut that it was looking straight at them. Claire stepped back. Her heels struck something solid behind her. A chair. In the mirror, no chair existed. Instead, there was space. Empty, inviting space, stretching wider than the living room could ever be. "That's not our house," Mark said hoarsely. Evan shook his head. "It is, it's just finished." The reflected door opened fully. Beyond it, the corridor branched into others, too many to count, archways folding into archways, rooms stacked impossibly deep. Lights flickered on in distant spaces, one by one, like stars coming alive. Then the sound came. Footsteps. Measured. Coordinated. More than one set. Claire reached for Mark's arm. "We're leaving. Now!" But the reflection did not move when they did. Their mirrored selves remained standing at the fireplace, staring inward. Smiling. Claire felt the smile before she understood it. It wasn't wide or exaggerated. It was precise, intentional. As if the reflected versions of themselves had practiced it. "Mark," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the glass. "They didn't move." "I see it," he said. He pulled Evan behind him, his body reacting faster than his thoughts now. The reflected Mark did the same, except his hand closed around the reflected Evan's shoulder a fraction too tightly. Evan gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and in the mirror the other boy flinched as well, though no one had touched him. The footsteps grew louder. They did not echo like normal steps. They arrived layered, overlapping, as if the sound were passing through walls that did not agree on distance. Claire felt it vibrate in her chest, not her ears. Something crossed the reflected doorway, not fully, just a suggestion of mass. A shadow that bent the light around it, taller than the doorframe, moving with a confidence that suggested familiarity. Ownership. The reflected Claire turned her head. The real Claire did not. But she felt it anyway, the unmistakable sensation of being examined from the inside out. "We shouldn't have found it," Evan said softly. Mark swallowed. "Found what?" "The way in." The mirror darkened. Not completely, just enough to blur the edges of the reflected room. The figures behind the frames withdrew, melting back into depth. The door began to close again, slowly, reluctantly, like a mouth deciding whether to finish a sentence. Then the reflected Evan raised his hand. The real Evan screamed. The glass flared with cold. Mark dragged Evan backward, stumbling over the rug, nearly falling. Claire hit the wall hard, enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The mirror snapped back to stillness, once again reflecting only the living room as it was, ordinary, harmless, and silent. Too silent. Minutes passed. No one moved. Finally, Mark spoke. "We're calling someone." "Who?" Claire asked. He had no answer. They covered the mirror that night, a thick blanket, then another. Mark nailed a sheet of plywood over it for good measure. Each strike of the hammer echoed strangely, as if answering blows came from deeper inside the wall. When he finished, sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold. Evan refused to sleep in his room. He curled up on the couch, eyes open, listening. Around 3 a.m, he heard voices again. Not from the living room, but from inside the walls. Soft, conversational, familiar. One voice sounded like his mother, another sounded like him. By morning, the plywood had warped, just slightly, as if something behind it had been leaning forward all night. Days passed. The plywood stayed in place, but the house did not forget. Every morning, Claire noticed subtle changes. A shadow moved differently across the floor. A floorboard creaked in a pattern that made her stomach twist. Even sunlight seemed reluctant, pooling awkwardly in corners as though the rooms themselves were unwilling to be illuminated. Evan remained vigilant. He rarely spoke, but at night he sat by the couch, eyes fixed on the covered mirror. He whispered to no one, naming the corridors, the doors, the strange figures he swore he saw behind the plywood. Mark tried to reassure him, but his own doubts grew heavier with each passing day. Even practical, logical Mark could no longer deny the strange things happening in the house. Tools, left in the workshop, were moved overnight. Lights flickered in sequences that defied wiring. And every so often, they could hear it. Faint scratching, like nails or claws, pressing from behind the wall, circling, testing boundaries. One evening, Claire tried to speak to the mirror, almost daring it. "I don't know what you want," she said softly, "but you can't have this house." Her voice echoed in the room, distorted, bouncing back with a strange delay. She touched the plywood lightly, expecting cold, but felt warmth, almost pulsing, as if something was waiting just beneath, eager. The children slept in shifts that night. Claire stayed on the couch beside Evan, listening. The house whispered. Footsteps padded in patterns no one could track. Doors opened in corners where none existed. Shadows crept against the walls, elongating unnaturally, bending toward them. And then the sound came again. Not footsteps this time, not whispers, but a voice. Clear, familiar, coming from behind the wall. "Evan!" The boy shivered violently. His eyes darted to Claire and Mark, but no one spoke. The voice repeated, softer this time. "Evan, come." Mark went to the plywood, pressing his ear to the surface. Nothing. He tried to knock, but the wall was solid. The sound did not return. The house fell silent. By morning, the family knew one truth. They had only delayed the inevitable. The mirror was not a thing. It was a presence, patient, aware, waiting for opportunity. Claire stood at the fireplace one last time, touching the rough wood where the mirror had hung. "We need to leave," she said. Mark nodded. Evan clutched his mother's hand, and so they left. The house settled again behind them, quiet as a tomb. But in the depths of its walls, in the space behind the hidden glass, something lingered, something patient, something that had learned to wait. No one would know exactly what or when until the next family arrived and the doors that should not exist began to open again. Chapter 5. The Mirror's End. The house waited. It waited for the next family, for the next life, for the next moment when someone's curiosity would allow it to reach out again. Claire, Mark, and Evan had left, but their presence lingered, small echoes trapped in the walls and corners. The furniture had been rearranged, the rooms tidied, but the house had memory, and memory was patient. Weeks passed. The property remained empty, the garden growing wild, vines curling up the porch railings, and oaks casting long, spindly shadows across the front lawn. Sunlight filtered in through the dusty windows in strange angles, and the air felt thicker, heavier, as though the house had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. The mirror waited too. Sealed behind plywood and hidden plaster, it pulsed faintly. A heartbeat, imperceptible but insistent. Behind the smooth surface, the reflection world stretched wide, corridors folding impossibly, doors appearing where none existed, rooms lit with a dim glow that had no source in the real world. It remembered. It had learned. Then the new family arrived. They were younger than the last, eager for a fresh start in a home that promised peace, light, and space. Children ran through the halls, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. The parents, two busy, practical people, spoke in measured tones, planning renovations, chores, and schedules. They saw a beautiful house. They did not yet see the house's hunger. The children found the living room first. They clustered around the fireplace. One of them, a boy not much older than Evan, had noticed the old wall covering the mirror. "Mom," he said, pointing. "What's behind that?" The parents exchanged glances. "Old wallpaper," the mother said lightly. "Probably some kind of patchwork from a previous renovation. Nothing to worry about." The children weren't convinced. They tugged, prodded, and eventually the covering came loose. Beneath it, the mirror revealed itself. Perfect, smooth, larger than it should have been. At first glance, they showed them their own reflections. Ordinary, safe. And then the glass rippled. Subtly at first. A bend in the image, a slight misalignment in the room behind them. The door appeared, slowly, deliberately. The family gasped. The father laughed nervously. Probably a trick of the light. But the trick of the light moved. It widened. A corridor appeared. Doors lined its walls. Shadows moved beyond the threshold, moving with awareness, intelligence, and intention. The children stepped closer. The mirror pulsed, responding to them. Each step they took made the reflected corridor grow longer. Each heartbeat they spent near it made the reflected world sharper, more real. Then the whisper came. Soft at first, barely audible over the sound of their own breaths. "Come." No one spoke. The whisper repeated. "Come, come, come." The mother felt her pulse spike. She grabbed the children. The father stepped forward, trembling, but unable to tear his eyes from the glass. Something moved in the reflection. Not a person, not quite human. Long, thin limbs that bent at impossible angles. shapes that shimmered like smoke yet had substance, faces that flickered in and out, twisted and unformed, but staring, watching, smiling. The family screamed, the glass warped, the living room behind them seemed to stretch impossibly, the fireplace melted into walls that should not exist. The children reached for their parents, but the reflections had already begun to mimic them. The mirrored father lifted his hand. The real father froze. The mirrored children raised theirs. The real children froze. In a blink, the house swallowed them. Not fully, not in a physical sense, but the reflected world claimed them, drawing the edges of their vision, their awareness, and their fear. They were trapped halfway between reality and reflection. Bodies in the room, mind stretched thin across corridors that defied space, ceilings that rose endlessly, and doors that led nowhere, except deeper. The mother screamed again, clutching her husband. Behind them, the mirror pulsed brighter, smoother, and wider. The reflection world had learned patience. It had learned to wait. And now, it had the children. By morning, the living room appeared untouched. The mirror reflected the room as ordinary, polished, harmless. No trace of the terror from the night before remained. Only the faintest chill in the air betrayed what had happened. Outside, the wind whispered through the oaks. Inside, the mirror waited. And somewhere, far beneath the polished surface, the reflections moved, watching, patient, smiling. The house would wait again, because some things do not end. They only wait for the next reflection, and the next family. Outside, the wind whispered through the oaks. Inside, the mirror waited. And somewhere, far beneath the polished surface, the reflections moved, watching, patient, smiling. The air in the living room shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. A faint vibration hummed through the floorboards, gentle enough to be ignored, but it grew steadily. A pulse, synchronized with some unknown heartbeat. Claire and Mark. No, the new family was already gone. Yet the room remembered them. The mirror held memory, sharper than any photograph. Every step they had taken, every glance, every whisper was etched into the glass. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching along the walls like dark fingers. The fireplace, polished to gleam, seemed deeper than it should have been, its carved arches casting reflections that moved independently. In one corner, where dust motes drifted lazily in sunlight, something stirred. Something alive, or at least aware. The house had learned patience. It had survived years of abandonment, renovations, new families, and fleeting curiosity. And it had learned something else. To draw those who dared enter its domain into the reflection. To bend reality. To make the impossible real. The mirror pulsed again, this time brighter. The glass rippled, faint waves travelling across its surface. A corridor emerged, longer, darker, with doors that should not exist, lined with shadows moving like smoke. Figures flickered inside the reflection, faces indistinct, twisted, almost human. They pressed toward the surface, just enough for the edges of their awareness to brush reality. A soft sound came from the mirror. Not footsteps, not whispers. Something between a sigh and a hum, low and deliberate. It grew louder. The vibration travelled along the floorboards, up the walls, and into the ceiling. The house itself seemed to exhale. The pulse intensified. Shapes emerged more clearly in the reflection. They were children. Familiar, yet not. Faces that mirrored past families, past victims, stared back at anyone who might enter. Their eyes were too sharp, too knowing, and too full of intent. Some reached toward the glass. Others pressed against it from inside, their hands leaving faint impressions that shimmered and disappeared before the eye could focus. The house waited, always waiting. The next family, oblivious to the mirror's history, would arrive in time. Their laughter, their curiosity, their footsteps, all would feed the pulse, feed the mirror. And one day, it would reach again. One day, the corridor would open wider, the reflections step through, and another set of lives would be caught halfway between the world they knew and the house's reflection. The wind shook the oaks outside. A branch scraped the window. The house responded. The fireplace flickered despite no fire. Shadows moved across the polished floor. The mirror shimmered faintly, anticipating. It had waited for decades. It would wait for centuries more. And one day, when the right pair of eyes met its surface, when the right heart pulsed with curiosity and fear, it would act. Then, nothing would be left to return. The house would keep what it wanted, and the mirror would smile. The mirror waited. Always. Even when no one was near, it pulsed with a subtle rhythm, a heartbeat of its own. Dust drifted lazily in the sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and something sharper, almost metallic. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, as though the house were listening. The floorboards vibrated slightly with a sound no one alive could hear, a hum that resonated directly in the chest. Behind the glass, the reflection world shifted. Corridors stretched endlessly, doors multiplied, rooms stacked impossibly one upon the other. Shadows moved along the edges, half-formed, almost human, but not human enough. Their faces flickered, twisted, grinning in a way that promised awareness, intelligence, and patience. They waited for attention, for eyes to meet theirs, for the inevitable curiosity of a new family. Sometimes, if the wind rattled the windows just right, or the sunlight caught the glass at the wrong angle, the mirror answered. A corridor would appear where none existed. A door would open slowly, inviting. A hand would press against the surface, just for a heartbeat, and then it would vanish, leaving nothing but the ordinary reflection of the living room, polished and perfect. No one came for months. The garden grew wild. Vines strangled the porch. The oaks towered over the house, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally as evening fell. But the mirror remembered. Every footstep, every laugh, every touch from past families was etched into its surface, sharpened by memory and time. A crow landed on the porch railing one morning, tilting its head. Its reflection in the glass did not mimic its movements perfectly. It lingered, watching, aware, before hopping into the yard. A faint ripple moved across the mirror's surface, like water disturbed by unseen hands. The house exhaled. The mirror pulsed again, slow, deliberate, each beat stretching across the walls and floors. Something moved behind it, a figure, indistinct but unmistakable. Children's faces, twisted in silent screams, pressed against the glass from inside the reflected world. Their hands left faint impressions on the smooth surface, fading like smoke in sunlight. It waited for the next family. It had waited for decades, and it would wait for centuries more. Patient, unyielding, hungering. No one knew. No one would know until curiosity led them too close, until footsteps echoed in the wrong rhythm, until hands brushed against the smooth surface. Then the corridor would open, the doors would multiply, the reflections would step forward, and once the mirror had what it wanted, it would never let go. The house was alive. The mirror was alive. The past, the present, and the future were folded into its depths, waiting silently. And when the next pair of eyes met its surface, when the right pulse of curiosity and fear aligned, the house would act. It would reach out, and it would take. The mirror's surface shimmered faintly in the late afternoon sunlight, perfectly still to anyone who glanced casually. But if one watched closely, truly closely, they could see a shadow move just beneath the surface, a hand flexing, a smile curling into something that was not quite human. The house waited, the mirror waited, and somewhere, far beyond ordinary sight, in corridors that could not exist, reflections whispered to each other. "Soon," they said. "Soon," the house agreed, and the waiting would end, only for a new beginning. The mirror pulsed one last time that evening, slower now, deliberate, as if satisfied that its message had been understood. Outside, the wind moaned through the oaks, rattling branches against the windows. The house groaned softly, its floors shifting under a weight no one alive could see. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and something sharper, something alive. For hours the house was still, too still. Even the shadows seemed to hesitate, stretching along the walls but never moving, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then the sun set, and a soft golden light spilled through the windows, catching the mirror. The reflection shimmered, the corridor inside stretching just slightly further. A single door opened, fully. The figure in the reflection stepped forward, half in, half still bound to the mirrored world, smiling with patient intent. It paused at the threshold, the hand pressed lightly against the glass, leaving no mark. The figure tilted its head, watching, waiting, and then it vanished. The house fell silent again, perfectly ordinary once more. The polished floors reflected only the living room. The fireplace gleamed. The air seemed normal. The wind outside softened. All traces of the previous horrors disappeared, hidden beneath the house's quiet, deceptive calm. Yet, beneath that calm, the house remembered. The mirror remembered. Every footstep, every glance, every whisper and scream was etched into the glass. The corridor still stretched. The doors still opened. The shadows still waited. And when the next family arrived, it would begin again. The house would whisper. The mirror would pulse. The reflections would stir. And another set of eyes would meet the glass. Another curiosity would be claimed. Another life would vanish, halfway between reality and reflection. The house, patient and eternal, exhaled, and the mirror smiled. The wind howled outside, and the oaks bent low, casting twisted shadows across the empty porch. The world moved on, but the house waited, always. The end.